Here's the knocking indeed. If a man were porter of Hellgate, he should have old turning the key. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? In the name of Beelzebub. Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in time. Have napkins enough about you. Here you'll sweat for it. Knock, knock. Who's there in the other devil's name? Faith. Here's an equivocator who could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Come in, equivocator. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? Faith. Here's an English tailor come hither for stealing out of a French hose. Come in, tailor. Here you may roast your goose. Knock, knock. Never had quiet. What are you? This place is too cold for help. I'll devil porter it no further. I had thought to let in some of all the professions that go the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire. Anon, anon. I pray you, remember the porter. Okay, here's a short analysis of the opening of Act 2, Scene 3, the porter scene. The first thing to notice is that this speech is not written in iambic pentameter. It's written as prose, like a paragraph, not poetry. Shakespeare does this with a lot of his working class characters, a lot of the servants. The noble characters tend to speak in a more learned, educated form of iambic pentameter poetry, while a lot of the servant characters do not. They just speak ordinary, unrhymed, non-poetic English. Now, the porter is supposed to be comedic relief, but it's pretty dark comedy. This is a guy who's pretending to be the porter at the gates of hell, rather than the porter at the gates of Macbeth's castle. But he is unknowingly, ironically, drawing a parallel. Macbeth's castle is a kind of hell because King Duncan lies dead inside. A really horrific act has just been committed before this speech gets made. The other theme, motif, that gets explored in this speech is the idea of equivocation. The porter lets an equivocator into hell. This is a man that could swear in both scales, in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, but could not equivocate to heaven. Equivocating is when you're lying, but not technically. Technically, the things that you're saying might be true, but you're definitely leaving stuff out and stating things in order to create a false impression. And the porter there says, well, you can't lie your way into heaven. You can't equivocate into heaven. You can't fool God and the final judgment. But equivocation is going to come back later in the play when Macbeth visits the witches again and gets the prophecy about his fate. And they tell him things like, no man of woman born can harm you, which gives him the false impression that he is invincible, when in reality he's not. So that equivocation element it's a motif that runs throughout the play, and the porter explores it in that scene. I pray you remember the porter.